Right then, so COBie, SOS, Mayday, help. So hello, my name is Emma and the committee asked if I would put something together about the basics of COBie for Revit users. So what qualifies me to talk about this? I'm an architectural technician by trade and now an information specialist at Bryan. Me and Revit have been friends for around about 9 years and I'm a former gunslinger. I love IFC, so much so I have a mapped out version of the schema above my desk at home. And I was co-author on the Delivering COBie Using Revit book, and failing that, I have some COBie socks. I was asked to put myself back in the shoes of a technician who is new to all this. Well, a few years back, that was me. You sat there modelling away, minding your own business, then someone says, we need some COBie. At this point, you have 3 options. Find the nearest window and jump out of it, change careers, or be brave and tackle it head on. It's just a bit of information, how hard can it be? While the process isn't the most user friendly, the good news is we can get a decent COBie output out of Revit. And back when I was looking at it, there wasn't that certainty. With this type of thing, I find half the battle is understanding the context of what you're actually meant to be doing. When I was looking at this, that information was definitely lacking, so hopefully what I'm going to say will make this foggy subject a little clearer. In my kitchen at home, I have a drawer, which is full of instruction manuals and warranties for all the items in my house. And I'm not going to lie, it is a complete mess, and it's a miracle I ever find anything. Scale this up to an office, a school, or even a hospital, and just think of all that information. What I've experienced is that this mess in my drawer is kind of a reflection of the information we hand over to clients. In fact, on a project I worked on, I spent some time with the estates department and they showed me what information they had for their buildings and how it took them hours to find anything. We either still deliver this in hard copy format, in physical folders and boxes, or poorly ordered 1,000-page PDFs where every page is completely different to the last. It would be so much easier if there was a standard for this, which allowed us to unlock the information by taking every piece, digitising it, and collating it in a structured and consistent way each time. BIM is all about the information exchanges, and handover is possibly the most important exchange of them all. But as an industry, we could be a whole lot better at this. Luckily, there is a standard to do this called COBie, and it stands for Construction Operations Building Information Exchange. It was developed in the US by Bill East in 2007, following his work with the US Army Corps of Engineers. Quoting Bill, it's a specification of the minimum information set needed to operate, maintain and manage typical buildings. It takes the design and construction information from many different sources on a project, digitises it and structures it in a way that it can be exchanged between contractor and owner for the in-use phase. And as it's based on a consistent specification, it means it can be checked. Now the COBie standards. This is where it starts to get a little bit confusing for us Brits. We now know COBie was developed in the US and it was approved in 2011 by the National Institute of Building Sciences as part of the US NBIM standard. In fact, NBIMS is a standard you should be aware of if you're producing or checking COBie. The standard is free to download, but you do have to create an account. Later we will see how it can help us answer these 2 important questions. What is included or excluded from COBie, and how do we fill it in? In the UK, we adopted COBie as our main information exchange, and even created a whole new British standard for it, BS 1192 Part 4. In this, we take COBie and we start to push the specification further by adding more purposes like building performance and health and safety, specifying additional information exchanges during design and construction, and applying the specification to other assets like infrastructure, which there is a lot of debate on. There are pockets in industry which are looking at these additions, but generally speaking, in the real world, the majority of industry is still trying to get the basics of maintenance and operational information correct before we even start thinking about these extras. And then we have project-specific requirements. If you're asked to provide COBie information, then there should be documentation on the project which lists what tabs are to be populated and when, what fields are to be populated when and by who, what items are to be included or not included, what format it's required in, and who will be responsible for the overall federation, checking and issuing of the information. All of this should be recorded in the Asset Information Requirements, which is part of the Employer's Information Requirements package. There are two main formats COBie can be delivered in. So the first one is IFC via a step physical file format, or spreadsheet file formats, and this is how we tend to think of COBie. Generally speaking, on projects, even if a client requests IFC models, they will still require COBie in spreadsheet format. In spreadsheet format, COBie is made up of several tabs or worksheets at the bottom of the screen. For this presentation, we will focus on the most common tabs, which is facility, floor, space, zone, type, component, system and attribute. And typically at the design stages, these are the parties responsible for adding that information. Within the tabs, each column represents a COBie field, and the syntax we commonly use to describe the location of these fields is COBie.tabName.fieldName. So if we wanted to specify asset type, on the type tab it would be COBie.type.assetType. So what elements should be included? And this is where we need to refer to our handy NBIM standard. On page 219 there is a table which lists all the IFC entities excluded from COBie. Therefore everything else should be included. And as a note, COBie is based on the IFC specification, which is why IFC notation is used. And if you're new to IFC, this language can seem daunting. So in plain language, these are the basic items which are not to be included. And if you do need reference for plain language when it comes to IFC, please refer to the Bryan BIM blog, and there's some information on there about it. Rule of thumb is it tends to be items which are on planned maintenance contracts with doors, windows, furniture and finishes. But of course a client can amend this and ask for more or less, so always refer to the AIR. The one issue I used to struggle with was finding guidance and examples of what information I needed to include in COBie. And for this, you can refer to NBIMS and BS 1192 Part 4. And for examples, you can refer to the models and COBie spreadsheets which were created to accompany the Revit and ArchiCAD COBie books. Here you will find a rather amazing architectural Revit model and COBie spreadsheet. These are free to download, but bear in mind as they use OmniClass rather than UniClass 2015 in the category fields. The information recorded in COBie is not meant to be anything additional to what you normally produce. It's meant to capture information shown on drawings and schedules and bring it all into one place. And these are some of the schedules which should be captured in it. And whatever you do, remember the first rule of COBie. It's about the fact that information must match the record drawings and schedules. And what do I mean by this? So let's take this door on the drawing. It is tagged as 101A. On the door schedule, it is named the same, and then in COBie, it's named the same as well. So the person looking for it can refer to any piece of information. You don't want to be looking at a plan which calls a door one thing, and then in COBie it's called something different. That's not going to help the maintenance person find it. Whenever you produce information, put yourself in the shoes of the person who is going to use it. So I mentioned COBie can capture all information from schedules, but what about things like voltage, floor finish or ironmongery set? There's no fields for these, so where do you put them? And that's right, but this information all gets captured in the Attributes tab. So now you have the basics, it's time to start the fun part. There are two ways to do COBie in Revit, and the method chosen will depend on what formats are required in the EIR and what has been agreed in the BIM strategy documentation. Method 1 is to export straight to a spreadsheet. This is for projects that just require a spreadsheet and no IFC. To do this, we use the Revit COBie Extension add-in. This is the method documented in the COBie book. Method 2 is to export to IFC. This is for projects which require IFC models and a COBie spreadsheet at handover, or it is a requirement of the party responsible for federating and checking COBie. To do this, we use the IFC exporter in Revit to generate the IFC, and then another software tool to export the COBie data from IFC to a spreadsheet. There are pros and cons using both methods, and both require values to be mapped to other values. But let's park this for a moment and look at what we can populate in Revit regardless of which method is used. Let's go back to basics and start with the parameters Revit already has, the hardwired ones. When it comes to Revit, I don't like creating parameters for the sake of it, and I will always try and use what is already created elsewhere. Just filling in these existing parameters will start you off on the right path. These tend to be filled in on projects anyway, as they are used in schedules and on drawings. Once exported, these will end up being translated into these COBie fields. For the rest of the data, it depends on which method you use. I'm going to give the general rationale behind both methods, but bear in mind, like with anything in Revit, there's always exceptions to the rule. The COBie extension for Revit. So for this method, you will need the COBie extension for Revit add-in and the classification manager. Both can be downloaded from the BIM Interoperability Tools website by Autodesk. After activating the extension, you will get a load of new parameters added to the project file. I call these the COBie dot parameters, and it's the values in these parameters which the extension is looking for on export. There is an individual parameter for each COBie field, including all those hardwired parameters we've just been looking at. But we've already filled these in. And that's one of the main jobs of the extension. It takes the values already added and copies them into its own COBie dot parameters. The The main setup generally tells the extension which of these hardwired parameters you would like to reuse. And the batch modify other fields dialog box takes the values and adds them to the COBie dot parameters, so you don't have to manually do it yourself. So now we've made sure that most of the hardwired ones will be exported correctly. So what about the rest? For these, it's a case of manually filling in the COBie dot parameters. For the category fields, we can use the classification manager to input this information to save having to do it manually. And if you already have other parameters which exist, your own custom ones or third-party content, these can be used by using the mapping dialog box. This mapping occurs on export, so the corresponding COBie dot parameters will not be populated in the model. A good example where this can be used are dimensional fields, which I think should never be filled in manually. You could map your width parameter to COBie nominal width, but try to keep the mapping to a minimum number of parameters for each field, as it can start to get quite complicated quite quickly. I also like this example as it starts to highlight why we need standardised non-element specific parameters. The parameters used in the families should be simply width, depth and height for every one. And attributes can be cherry-picked from the properties list available in the model. The parameters selected should match the ones used in your schedules. When you're ready to do an export, click the export button. I've gone back. You need a blank spreadsheet created first. And if I have some tips for using this method, keep doing test exports as you go along to make sure the outputs are as you expect. And keep the configuration as simple as possible. So the second method is the IFC export method. And for this you'll need the latest version of the IFC exporter, as this regularly updates. And to give some automation to the process, you can use the classification manager and also Dynamo or an Excel link tool. For this presentation, however much I would like to, I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of IFC, but I do want to start by giving you some context, and to do this I want to show you this diagram. This circle represents the IFC schema. It is a structure of entities, attributes and properties, all linked via relationships. Although it does include a lot of stuff, it doesn't include everything. And what is good about IFC is you can add additional properties on the side and link them back to the main bit. So where does COBie come in? You've all heard COBie is a subset of IFC. So basically this means it takes some of the bits of IFC, the entities and the attributes, and then adds its own properties. So at the overlap, what takes priority? Since IFC is the main schema and could be potentially used for many other purposes on a project, like costing and coordination, the configuration of IFC takes priority. And this is why we have this second method. And on this slide you can see some of the COBie fields and where they live in relation to IFC. To start with, let's go back to our hardwired parameters. Most of these will export automatically using the IFC exporter, but type mark, mark and description won't, and these are kind of important as these name and describe most of the entities in IFC and COBie. Otherwise, we will get Revit's dreaded family and type names exporting by default, and we don't want those. We need to add 4 new parameters: IFC name, IFC name, IFC description and IFC description. And no, I haven't gone mad. Each of these are added at type and instance level. Our existing type mark, mark and description parameter values need mapping to these. And rather than do it manually, it can be done via pushing the data into Excel and back out by using the get parameter and set parameter functionality of Dynamo. And using some more parameters which work with the exporter, we can populate nearly all the data required in that overlap. In Revit, we have our lovely categories to order our elements. However, these don't align with the way that IFC orders its entities. So in Revit, we have to tell each element what it's going to be in IFC. And this is what these two parameters do. They help to give the elements an identity in IFC, and this translates to COBie in the scary purple columns. To assist in filling these in, there is another handy page on the Bryan BIM blog. The values in green populate IFC export as, and the values in purple populate IFC export type. Within the overlap, there was the COBie category field. In IFC, there is a special place for classifications like Uniclass, and this is used to populate those category fields in COBie. In Revit, you can name the classification parameters however you like, but they need to be listed in the classification settings box in the IFC exporter. The value, though, must follow this syntax: reference, name. And to help you, you can configure this using the classification manager. So what about the rest of the properties? The ones which only live in COBie and not IFC. These COBie parameters can be added from the MBS shared parameter file, which is available from the National BIM Library. So you have these in your model. How do you export them to IFC? We need to first create custom property sets so they have a place to live within the schema. And then we need to specify which parameter belongs to which set. And this can be done by configuring the custom property set text file loaded in the IFC exporter. So that's a basic overview of setting up the parameters, and now you're ready to create the IFC. This is where you need to configure the IFC exporter. For COBie, one of the most important exporter tabs is the Property Sets one. This is where you start to select what information you want to take with you from Revit. We need to take through the information which is only required for COBie, and to make sure it lives in the correct place in IFC so it can be checked. Therefore, under no circumstance whatsoever should you ever tick this box. What it does is it takes the random data from the Revit model and dumps it in the IFC. It's the equivalent of picking up a bin of mixed rubbish and tipping its contents into a container which has compartments. Most doesn't land in the right place and you get loads of rubbish you don't want. If we think of it in terms of that diagram from earlier, at the moment we have a nice clean data structure, but checking that tick box will essentially do this: create duplicate information which is not in the correct place and which varies each time. How can you create automated rules to check chaos? Once you have the IFC, you need a tool to extract out the COBie data set and put it in a spreadsheet format. Over the years, there's been an ongoing joke that there is no such thing as a BIM button. And there isn't really, but these programs do kind of have COBie buttons. And some of the programs are XBIM, which is free, BIM server, that's free, and COBie model checker, that's not free. And just to prove it, here's the BIM server button. Okay, so we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's backtrack to Revit. We've missed out an important step, checking the information. You wouldn't normally issue a drawing without it being checked, so we need to do the same with any datasets we issue. Instead of seeing data as secondary to drawings, we need to start thinking them as being equal. And there are some checks that we can do inside and outside of Revit. The first is the good old schedule. Remember, most of the information required for COBie should already be on drawings and in schedules. Therefore, we need to start here, as any errors will percolate through. It's also where the information should be checked to make sure it's factually correct. An example is a fire rating which should be 60 minutes is actually 60 minutes. Automated checks aren't going to pick that up. Next, we can create schedules in Revit which are representative of COBie, including any of the middlemen mapping parameters we touched on earlier. Doing a visual check like these, you will soon notice if any cells are blank or randomly populated. And in Revit, you should be spending as much time in schedules as you would do in 2D and 3D views. The second way is to keep on top of warnings. Yes, they can be annoying, but they are there for a reason. It means something is wrong in the Revit database. And Revit actually warns us if we have duplicate type mark and mark values. Therefore, please don't ignore them and resolve them as you go along. And the third way is the model checker for Revit add-in. This is kind of Revit's version of COBie. It works off predefined XML rules which can be configured to check all different aspects of Revit models, including data. So it can be used to check COBie no matter what method you use. There are already predefined rules set up for the COBie Extension method, although these may need some tweaking. The IFC method would need much more configuration, but once done, the ability to perform these checks within Revit would be very powerful and allow users to rectify any problems before the information manager sees them. And outside of Revit, you could carry out basic checks using Excel, or if you do have access to COBie Model Checker, you can perform rule-based automatic checks. And the ultimate check is the COBie QC checker. This is a tool developed by Bill East. For Excel files, it uses the Windows command prompt to check the file, or for IFC, it uses a plugin for BIM server. And the result is a HTML report. It's the ultimate check as it's being checked against the rules of the COBie schema. And details for this can be found in the Quality Control Book by Bill East. On projects, all final issued COBie datasets should have one of these reports with it showing 0 errors. And there's also nothing stopping you from running these internally. So hopefully this has helped a little bit in trying to decipher the COBie puzzle. I think the most important message is to understand the project requirements and how the information will be used, as this will help you to decide which method to use. And from a Revit perspective, understand that the two methods are separate. If you try to merge them with how it is set up at the moment, you will get messy outputs and a lot of waste. And for more information, we have several channels at Bryan Digital, with blog, Twitter and LinkedIn. And over the next few months, I'll be taking over the reins of the blog, where I'll be talking more about this type of stuff in more detail, and lots of other related Revit-y topics. And yeah, that's Bryan Digital. So yeah, that's the end.